The Valkyrie, her appetite whetted, spoke. And what is the form of man that feeds on the blood of man? The tender replied, in the old stories it is the vampire that feeds on man. The Valkyrie spoke. And how long does the vampire live while feeding on man? The tender replied, the vampire will live as long as there is blood to drink. The Valkyrie, lusting, spoke. Is the blood of your body the only blood there is to be fed upon? The tender spoke. It is not. There must be the blood of the body, the blood of the mind, and the blood of the spirit. The Valkyrie, with deep breath, spoke. And what about collective man? Does blood pertain only to the individual? What is it that causes to give life to tribes, and to communities of tribes, and to cities, and to nations? The tender replied, they must have their blood just as the individual has his blood, for each of those accumulations are themselves individuals. The Valkyrie, her hand gripping spear shaft, spoke. Does not blood flow to that in which it is invested? The tender spoke. It does. It flows to the requiring muscle. It flows to clean the requiring wound. The Valkyrie, stern in eye, spoke. Is the vampire an admired form in the world of man? The tender spoke. The vampire is a reviled form and a feared form. The vampire is recognized as darkness embodied, an almost pure form of evil. The vampire lived within and yet apart. It fed on the community nearby. It realized it must keep its presence quiet. It must remain hidden. It must not be so greedy as to be discovered. It must live thus at night, in the shadows. The vampire lives where it is not discovered. The vampire thus must understand that, as a shade of darkness, it does best to exist in shadow. The Valkyrie, standing firm and tall, spoke. But what is there in life that does not evolve over time, that does not learn given the chance? The tender spoke. All things, given the chance, adapt to the extent of their capability. The Valkyrie, watching with ancient eyes, spoke. And thereby, what might you expect to know, were you to live indefinitely? The tender spoke. I would expect to know whatever I had set myself to know, for in that time one might know much. The Valkyrie, a light in silver, spoke. Describe to me the form of the vampire. The tender spoke. The form of the vampire is the fear of death. The Valkyrie, fierce in purpose, spoke. And what does the archetype subsume? The tender spoke. The archetype is both the hoarding dragon and the vampire. The two are phases of the one. Each takes and keeps and does not let go. The Valkyrie, enticing the man with solemn beauty, spoke. Speak to me of their desire. The tender spoke. The vampire is known merely for the diet of blood, but there is more to the vampire than that. The nature of the archetype connotes a relationship, the parasite and the host. The parasite feeds from and thereby weakens the host. The vampire may thus be found upon the body and in this way may be deemed little different from the mosquito, though almost infinitely longer lived, hence the dragon. But the vampire may also work upon the mind. It may feed from the mental vitality of the mind, for just as the body must be fed for it to function, so too must the mind. The vampire attending to the mind of a man must thereby feed from the vitality inherent in thought itself. And in this way the vampire becomes purely of the human world, for just as we share the body of mammals, so we distinguish ourselves by our minds. And thus too must the vampire act upon spirit, for does not the reflection upon beauty give rise to spirit? And does not spirit give rise to a piercing mind? And does not a piercing mind question what draws upon its blood? And so, while spirit itself must be the most satisfying of all that might whet the tongue of the vampire must consider the risk, for it has learned in its years that in the past it was those with spirit that fought back, that discovered that only the wood of Michael's spear is sufficient to bring about salvation. The vampire must hide in order to feed. And so the vampire in time learned that he would come out in day only where he could not be seen. Man would have to lose his sight of what the vampire truly is. And so the vampire in time took control of the stories of man. The vampire depicted itself as a caricature, something dreadful out of the imagination of a less developed people. Only then would people forget to look. Only then would they disassociate their instinct from their knowledge and forget that the vampire once lived amongst man and fed from him and weakened him and took from his tribe its life, until the life was gone and the vampire would move on to the next while remaining unknown. The tender paused and considered, and the Valkyrie, coursing with power, said nothing. The tender spoke again. Of course there are grades to the vampire's diet. It is indicated in the old stories that the vampire may, like all others, come upon hard times. The vampire finds that care requires he not be conspicuous, so he might have to resort to feeding from animals other than man. Man thus is seen as constituting a richer source of nutrition for the vampire than the blood of other animals. The vampire is fundamentally interested in life force. The vampire must counter his inherent fear of death with the life force most likely to most strongly counter death. And it must be considered that death, if feared by the vampire, must be considered strong. The vampire's feeding will naturally seek that which most effectively counters the strength of the threat. The vampire would live eternally. That is the pure form of the vampire, his extended life. But that is not all there is to the pure form of the vampire. As there are grades to the vampire's diet, so too are there grades to the vampire itself. The vampire's diet ranges from the lowest grades of blood to the highest grades of blood. The lowest grade, the old stories would tell us, would be, for example, the rat amidst squalor, which may keep a vampire through particularly hard times. Only slightly better, the animals of the isolated farm, those he might take before reaching again into the world of man. The loss of the rats is never seen. The loss of livestock may be blamed on the wolves. But man has grades too, both between men and within the individual man. The novice or unintelligent vampire, or the vampire living amidst men who have come to know care and wariness, may satisfy itself with feeding from the periphery, from the most dispensable edges of the society. The more peripheral the power from which it feeds, the less notice the feeding will be, the less import it will have on the society, and the less likely the vampire will be to be sought out and captured and killed. The vampire must not be identified as such. His veil is his life within a society that still lives. The novice vampire thus feeds at the periphery while salivating for what more may be had, the mouse, the lamb, the shepherdess, or in the city, the rat, and then the homeless, long before those of power and import. But with lifespan comes experience and the potential for skill to be employed, and the vampire realizes he has options. Where the blood is weak but plentiful, he may feed, provided he does not mind the indignity and provided he may remain hidden. And so he may pretend himself to be weak, and thereby avoid notice. He, like all, finds, though, that he wishes for more, but this requires his cover be even more carefully guarded, and so, as his care for his silence increases, so he may begin here and there to feed from more vital sources, those ever closer to the apex. But what is the apex where blood is concerned? The Valkyrie's eyes gleamed blue towards the tender, and he met her eyes and continued. The apex where blood is concerned is blood infused with a deeper and richer life force than that which merely feeds the flesh. The richest blood is that which does not fear death, which embraces death in order to live, rather than feeling death in order to have the lifeless life, which is the life of the vampire, long-lasting but empty and fundamentally anemic. The greatest prize of the vampire, thus, must be the heroic blood man carries. That is the blood that would notice and kill the vampire, the blood represented by Michael's spear, the ash shaft that would pierce the vampire heart, without which the vampire may grow latent but always shall live. The blood of the heroic element is infused not with merely that which feeds the flesh, but with that which feeds the mind. It is the root of what separates man from the beasts of field and farm. The heroic element is craved above all as that which is most lacked, and it is that which simultaneously provides the greatest threat. The vampire, after all, will retreat to the periphery rather than die. Only his ultimate nemesis shall spurn weakness over death. Just as man must negotiate with the world and navigate compromise, so too must the vampire. And so the clever vampire learns that the results of negotiation are rooted in the beginning terms. The vampire must separate the weak from the herd until he has enough that the herd becomes his own. Only then may he realize he needn't gorge in hunger and thereby kill. He realizes instead that he may keep what he may keep in thrall. And that is the beginning of his hoarding. To hoard there must be control, and to control the blood of man, the flesh of man must be held, and to control the flesh of man, the mind must be held, and to control the mind of man, the spirit must be held. Thereby he may both feed and protect his gains at once. The vampire with nothing scavenges, the vampire that has learned corrals, the vampire that has learned more still breeds and trains. The vampire that has learned even more has others breed, train, and provide. Then the vampire is not even recognized as existing. He himself has come to articulate a norm, where his way is upheld as all other ways have been forgotten. Thereby the vampire starts with the body in seeking for spirit. Thereby the vampire feeds first at the periphery while salivating for the apex. And what is the apex of spirit? It is the heroic collective, for the heroic collective, where achieved in the world of man, is that which has drawn the most life energy to itself. It is the concentrated mass of power, but it is also the greatest threat, for the vampire knows that the heroic collective is such as it is through being careful in its capability. It is resilient through awareness and steadfastness in its strict adherence to need. It is satisfied only to ever achieve that which is better, and to achieve that all that might weaken must be shunned. The heroic collective derives its power from its ability to direct the energy it controls to its actual need. To recognize need amidst potential distraction requires intelligence to discern the difference between need and desire, and also the will to maintain stern adherence to the dictates of that intelligence, even where the flesh or even the mind might be tested with the promise of respite. Such a society is the greatest prize and the greatest threat to the vampire. It is the greatest prize for its vital strength, and it is the greatest threat, for not one in such a herd is easily separated and taken. And where attempts are made, such a society shall not stand idly by, but shall sense the threat and respond with immediate violence in protection of its life. In the heroic collective, the periphery is the apex, and the apex is the periphery. The body is infused with spirit, just as is the mind in between. The life is complete, as the will is complete. They have become of one single body, mind, and spirit. By that they know their power. The prize of the advanced vampire is thus to win the spirit of such a collective, to control its capability while stultifying the threat it might once have shown. To evolve, that is to live, the vampire must be clever. He must sidle and hide, he must pretend, he must gain trust. To gain trust, he must eradicate that which would question his role. To do so, he must shift the perception of the society to perceive him as of value, and his most potent potential enemies are those that are the greatest threat. But he knows that those strong in spirit will always recognize him for what he is, and so he must work to stifle spirit in favor of minds that he can control. The strength of spirit within the society must be usurped and replaced with another currency, and it is that currency and what it relies upon that is thus employed. Where the vampire cannot entice spirit, he must entice mind. He does so through the distraction of mind from spirit and the reconfiguring of the mind so that it seeks satisfaction not from spirit but from other sources instead. He must control the mind, and therefore he must understand the mind. He must understand that the faculty of reason must be fully employed to tasks that do not include the analysis that would make him susceptible. The faculty of reason must be harnessed to a cause that may feed the vampire. The vampire knows that the rational mind will, when allowed, attend itself to the imaginative mind, for that is its core duty, and so the vampire realizes that the imaginative faculty must also be employed, distracted in the consideration of nothing that will shed light on the shadows the vampire must keep in order that he might remain hidden. And so, the vampire must control and entice. He must control the means that the man perceives his life to be reliant upon. He must control the means by which the man affords his bread, and he must entice the man ever away from the means by which the man may be led to question. In the body, in the most superficial aspect, it is recognized the vampire requires the blood, but this is only a depiction, a likeness. It is itself a shadow, a reference to a deeper reality, a deeper meaning. The old stories, thus, in depicting the vampire, spoke of one who seeks blood, while the actual meaning to be derived was a warning against those that would control man's life force itself, in whichever form that might take. And in the real world of life, the experienced life, that blood is gold. In the real world of life, the human real experience of life, the vampire is a reference to a type of person, a breed of person who craves control for no purpose beyond control itself, regardless of its consequences for the controlled. The cause is the satisfaction of insatiable appetite, an appetite that is by nature averse to that which would limit its craving. It is an appetite that is definitionally psychopathic. It is the extreme form of the fear of death in man. It is the extreme form of the notion of self-importance regardless of virtue. It is the extreme form of self-entitlement that, having lost all for its sins and not for its virtues, continues to consider itself the chosen. Its own God reflects its will, for it is the will that chooses the archetype, and it is the realization of the will that demonstrates the archetype's nature. For that reason, where vampires were attracted, like moths, to the light emitted by the concerted force of true creative civilization, and where they fed, and where the effects of their feeding became realized in time, they were banished or, more wisely, killed. The wise killed, for they realized that to banish was to betray. They realized that an invader allowed to flee would then invade a neighbor, and the neighbor would be harmed and would no longer be able to trust, and conflict would arise. They realized that to banish was to enable. They realized that the sickness would merely remanifest where able, and they, in reference to their considered duty, wished to protect others like them as much as they wished to protect themselves. And how was that? It was because, living according to their true spirit, they remained joined to others, for that spirit was shared by all, whereas the mind and body depicted the difference, local and particular to their tribe. And so the pallid, devoid of spirit, replaced spirit with gold, and henceforth man would trust in gold, and then he could be controlled. Gold would be the common currency, and the vampire, long in life, would control the currency upon which man's mind had been trained to rely. No more would man commune with his father, and no more would he feed from his mother. Instead, an intermediary would apply, and that intermediary would be the vampire and his kind, and his mechanism would be the gold he had hoarded and controlled. But man's need for gold need not be limited to that required for bread. As the old story is told, the vampire is insatiable, and to increase his kind and to increase his power, to avoid his fear of death, he would turn to his means to entice. He would play upon man's mind in all the ways that proved available. That meant encouraging man's desire over his need, and so the desires of man's mind would be tapped as well as the desires of his body. And he would be taught that all should have happiness through plenty, as all changes, and so does man, and so with each season he would need to reassert himself through the fleeting expression of desire. The distance between man and woman grew while simultaneously shrinking. The whims of each were encouraged, man to fight and women to crave, and so women in bred expectation encouraged man in what would enrich her, and man was thus enabled in his fight. In his diminished trust he was enriched, but only to a semblance of the spirit he no longer remembered. The recognized value shifted from interconnection to power, and yet in each and every interaction the intermediary was there, taking his cut, the agreed reward of the enabling of the achievement of power measured in gold. And in the aftermath, in the wake, cities of tribes once rightly proud lay in ruins, their inhabitants desecrated, their customs forgotten, and a new horde was created to fuel the next, which would arise just as needed, just as spirit might threaten to be remembered. And so the deification was reset, from the unavoidable, incontrovertible need of spirit to strive, and mind and body to serve, to the service of mind and body and all that could be contrived to entice the desires of each. Thus the vampire developed the means of his feeding. The lifeblood became the gold that allowed the feeding of man's retrained expectation. Ideas enticed and the gold allowed, and where the gold could not be mustered from within, it would come from the vampire's hoard, and always only upon the promise of security, and only upon the promise of interest, that upon failure the intermediary would gain the property of the weaker, and upon achievement the intermediary would gain wealth in repayment according to the vampire's self-profiting terms. And where satisfied, the host would linger, but never for long. As always they must be made to crave, always their women must be made to desire, always men must be set against brother, in distrust, in competition, that he might never again remember that once his spirit was shared, that as an infant he grew from the same spring as he with whom he was set to war. But that realization of his power, that ultimate hoard by which he would rule all, and thereby, as a chosen, achieve the avoidance of death, was beyond his power alone, and for long he lived apart, shunted here and there, if not killed by Michael's spear when discovered. And while man remained at the mercy of the immediate reality of his mother, the allowing instigator of death, the source of immediate inspiration and humility, while man remained able to see for himself, the vampire would be hindered. The vampire was thus never just another creature, but in a certain sense the vampire was a character type, one that followed that way of being, one who had taken, whether by birth or by choice, that impetus for his own. But that being said, you, Valkyrie, beautiful warrior, lover of heroes, daughter of Michael, referred to the dragon tribe. And by that I understood you to mean that one tribe above all carried that trait, or that the trait itself existed as if a gene that passed through generation to breed where it may. Traits breed like any organism, any entity breeds. They go where they may go, they spread as far as their environment allows them to spread. And the traits that we know of those of the vampire, that mythical figuration contrived to connote magic, by which it may be forgotten as legend, those traits are the traits that one tribe carried and maintained where all others rejected. It is not that the dragon tribe of which you speak was the only tribe that tried. It is just that it was in that tribe that trait became prevalent, twisted and wound and bound into the construct of the self-identification of those that bore the mantle of that particular family of man. They focused not for what might come after. They were already chosen, by definition. But their self-understanding, they forgot in their brief period of success, was questioned and chastened, and then they were forced from the land they had claimed. Forsaken by their own god, become their own god, they walked and served and festered in spite, while never understanding what it was that caused their shunning. They were unwilling or incapable of changing what they had by then become to identify as their right. They practiced what others had learned to shun. They claimed their land, but never acknowledged how it was they broke it. Only others beside were left to judge, and when those that saw recognized the depletion resulting from the presence of that which sought by control of blood, of the gold suggested and required to trade, only then did wrath take hold, only then did regulation arise where governance had failed. The dragon tribe was called the dragon tribe because they depicted the traits manifested in the story of that dragon. The vampire that achieved the hoard became the dragon, holding all while outside his guarded cave the world beside wept its loss. For of the gold the dragon guarded, every coin represented the spirit of a man, woman, or child, and every gem the soul of a hero brought down by the weight of those that fell around him. These events are forgotten, except in marvelous, dislocated stories of the past, where they seem fantastic and removed from all that has come to be known. Their existence cannot be denied, and yet their basis is never asked after, or is only ever blindly confronted. The vampire represents the success of those traits if allowed in the world, and once the vampiress has become the dragon, who but the greatest hero might hope to unseat him, to end his scourge, to allow life to grow again from the surrounding desiccated land. Only the greatest hero, only he who, unafraid of fire, may pass through and win the warrior maiden, and thus the young life of pristine man. The dragon hates, as a result of his fear, above all, the heroic in man. Only the heroic, those who refuse to turn from their own spirit, who thus realize what is beyond, only they are impervious within to the vampirous enticement by which the dragon gained and holds its power. It is the hero that sees the hierarchy of law, whose reference to life itself causes him to revolt from the threat and to draw his sword in warning. And many did draw their swords in warning, and they were those who, as gems of crystalline light, ended up within the piles of the dragon's hoard. For they, while heroic to realize and threaten, did not fully realize the threat they faced. Their adversary, with face covered in treacherous appearance of fear, knowing that threat alone, nor even sword alone, would kill him, would cower and appeal to pity, and those he had won would soften, and he would be allowed to live, and the credit he held would be, for a time, forgiven. But not forgotten. The sword could not muster his fear, as he knew that his limbs would regrow and spread once wounded. So long as he lived, whether hated and outcast or not, he would find the blood he craved. Thus the outcasting served to strengthen the vampirous will, and each time he would try again, and he would grow again, and his limbs outstretched across borders, and his saplings grew as immature invasive shoots of his fundamentally concerted will, and each time he would lock in a little further his capitalized gains. In all those years, streams of gold were siphoned off to the dragon's stores, and all the while the work was done to allow a growth to remain. The vampire waited while his prize grew fat and stupid and weak, while whispers of encouragement fueled it all. One day a chance would come, and the tribe's ancient enemies would find themselves powerless, their sword arms fueled by the very force they should have been used against, and none by then remembered the spear. And all the while the dragon hoard grew, and no one saw where the value of the gold had gone, only that the proceeds of their work gained them less and less that satisfied. The host then grew so weak that it sat amused by the vacuous, while resplendent in the self-satisfaction their hidden masters had stoked. For by the time the dragon had compiled his hoard, he had learned to own the food by which the body would be fed, and the food by which the mind would be fed, and he had distracted the body and mind sufficiently that spirit was forgotten. In concentrating on seeding and feeding the desire for adornment, man forgot the beauty of strength and himself became anemic. And in seeding the thirst for connection, he became diseased with carnality. All this was seeded through thought, through training, the diminishment of expectation. Thus the vampirist recognized that he could sell all that he could manage to sell, that those infected would buy all that they could be convinced in their weakness to buy, and when they had bought all they could buy, and were still unsatisfied, they wanted more, and then the hoard would be harnessed, for with every coin soon given 2 more would be made, and returned to the hoard for the dragon to guard. Thus the vampirists learned that they could glean the blood they craved threefold, in the sale of dissatisfaction, in the rooting of further desire, and in the interest gained through the credit offered. And it was all for that which provided nothing of gain to any but the dragon's hoard. Layer upon layer of riches they procured, and with those riches, where their ground felt stable, they would buy their position through marriage, and where the ground needed maintaining, they would supply their services in apparent good faith to the tending of society's needs. The vampire had learned his need to be silent in his feeding, thus he focused on the gold, thus the moving of paper, thus the framing of the society's mind. Society then would be trained to avoid what would give rise in future to their resistance, and they endeared themselves, bought their innocence with a small portion of their stolen gains. They proved their goodwill with apparent good deeds, the generosity that would appear to prove their loyalty. But never would such generosity be taken from the capital, it was only ever a reinvestment of interest. Always alongside the places they founded were those that starved, those that once hunted and tilled fields, with brothers and sisters, with mothers and fathers under the sun, and within the comfort of birdsong they had heard since birth. But all of that would be forgotten once the factories were built by which those outside could be drawn and harnessed. Then, when the streams became polluted with the spreading death, the stories were shared that all before was toil, when the feeling of the sun was forgotten, when the bathing in fresh country river was forgotten, then they no longer would be missed, and eventually never more would be sought. And then the vampires would live forever on the blood. They themselves would be the gods, and would pass wrath on any that might spite them. The strain would be felt by the host, but his inherent strength, once directed to match the challenge of weather or the rigor of the hunt, was established as the honor of suffering through toil, no matter the cause, no matter the promise entailed. But the toil cost too much for one old wolf tribe when reality struck and momentarily the veil lifted. For hundreds of years the dragon horde had grown. It financed the wars of kings and princes made jealous. It allowed those wars, it provided for those wars, and it profited from those wars, and then the shackles were set and the dragon's realm crossed oceans. Soon the world would belong to the dragon, but the dragon's war, that which would give it all it thought desired, was not enough. The horde, dispersed, became too great to be held amidst others. The dragon sought the land it had lost so many years before. No more would others peer into the windows potentially to wonder. And so the indebted host, seeking to please its master, would give to it of land that it had won through toil. But the loser in that war, thought beaten, thought succumbed, was not. For, amongst its warriors alone, its old blood lingered, and from that blood, in the realization of loss, that tribe, a wolf tribe, would rise and seek once and for all to dispossess the veiled proud, and reclaim the honor that they remembered had been theirs. The shackles had rusted in the damp cold of fields, the soldiers had worn thin, and the shackles slipped from bloodied ankles. The emaciated stood again and remembered Michael's spear. Their old stories still lingered around fire in the deepest woods. Their spark had not yet gone out. They, with nothing left for which to fight, but for the very life of their tribe, arose with the ash shaft in hand. And in the light that gleamed from spearhead, they looked and saw the dark strands that had woven throughout their land. They called out to one neighbor, a lion of a tribe, for support, but there the shackle held stronger. But they, enticed by the sun, were indebted the more, and so the wolf tribe would stand alone, and this time they knew that banishment would be betrayal. The time for banishment had passed, the words had been too strong, the betrayal too great, and they saw the dragon spawn enriched. And while they saw the dragon spawn enriched, they saw the results of the instruments that had been employed, not just the machines of war, but the machines of capital which, having desolated the land, had moved on to attack their very own blood. Like some sort of virus, it spread through the marketplace, and all that traded and all that relied on trade once the last plough had been set to rot away, all were affected. Blood became thin, simple bread became worth more than the value of the promises given, that it was claimed had been backed with gold. The gold was gone, inaccessible, subsumed within deep caves. The paper had plastered over the emptiness of souls. All others, despite living within sight of fields, went hungry. The cities they once ruled, no longer theirs, had allowed the deceit. They slept and never mentioned the shackles they wore. Enchained, cousin fought against cousin. Again the finance of war would speak. It was not that it was not known. All knew, and yet with every step taken there was but one winner, that which must not be denied, that which by then had become the provident hand. It was the final whisper of recognition that schemed for the banishment with the affording of land. Some thought to avoid the otherwise inevitable confrontation through separation, but that was not what was desired. What was desired was all, and in addition a mother den. And when that wolf tribe rose up and took back what had been taken, the voice of the vampire whispered again in ears. The quiet masters had spoken. No more would the defiled lords have recourse to the horde. They would be set to suffer, security claimed, the transfusions would cease, and the nation would collapse. Thus cousin stood against cousin. It had not felt the ultimate recognition of the slavery. Despite losses it had won. Despite the loss of all that had been gained, it had been made to think that it had won. And so it turned against cousin, for already it had forgotten the betrayal depicted in every house of the land. Such was the depth of the loss, that even that could be overlooked. The brethren had allowed precisely that which their tribe had learned to abhor. They were seduced, long reliant, and yet still the takeover was incomplete. It had fueled the seeds of destruction of all that man loved, the solemnity of the field, the beauty of the stream, the community of warriors breathing the music of wind. The industry had fueled the war, and it was the horse that lost. It was the horse and the remainder of the pride of the horse, the independent herd, the animal that would stand above fallen rider and loyal love, the horse that had lived with man and spoken to him of spirit. The gold-spurring industry killed off the connection between man and beast. The future would be different. Nothing was enough. Machines would henceforth draw the plough. The wolves snarled. Even they would fight for the horse, and the wolf tribe were such that rider was to be as the battle horse. They were to carry the spirit. Foreign were the calls to peace and weakness and impotence, and yet gradually they had been accepted in all but some. That was the feeding that drew from the spirit, the distraction of the mind away, the enticement of comfort, the enticement of delight. The stern solemnity was all but forgotten. But was it not that the signs had been seen? Was it not that the weak had come to rule? And was it not that even the common man, removed from field, had forgotten? And was it not that the learned had been corrupted, and had forgotten what built the hallowed halls in which they studied, and what voices had come before to bear witness to the sublime? Even the students, even the learned, had forgotten the sublime, forgotten the meetings with angels in the lofty spaces that had been for so long called home. They had forgotten the words of their poets. No longer did they hear the songs around fires, and no longer did they recall the sad plea of the cobbler to remember. But even the cobbler had submitted, in his good, generous nature, to the forgiving and to the allowing. The clerk should have been checked then for exposing his presumption for Eve, encountering the symbol of the true in the night of the wood. That night had not yet been claimed, and so the clerk accosted and exposed an insolence that leashed his fury, and yet still the good people forgave and welcomed. The wolf tribe was not as interested in war as later generations were led to believe. For generations in good faith they allowed the creeping, the clawing, the leeching, the eventual shackling of their kind. Thus cousins were set against cousins. Those that should have stood side by side within the world were set against each other to weaken and eventually, once sucked dry, to die. The archangel surveyed the battlefield. A core of industry was isolated and defined. Man's inventiveness must be allowed. He must develop his potential in the world, but it was to be limited and reined. The children were returned to the farms that they might grow, known and loved in the sun, that their muscles might grow strong, that they might know the horse, oxen, and sheep, that they might sleep beneath stars and know for what they reached, and the clarity of mind they were to retain. The cities shrank, became focused to serve rather than to feed. No more would the knowledge of other be disjointed. No more would the blood of the people be siphoned. No more would walls of paper separate brother from brother. No more were the lords of the land to know the way of excess. No more would they be enticed to crave. They would again lead the hunt. That was their field to till. They would again be the lean and the strong, the first to charge upon the field of battle. And the schools would again open the minds of the young, first to duty and fitness, and then to the serving of the tribe, and then to the seeking of angels. In the serving of the tribe, not all were to serve alike in application, but all according to principle, and so all learned the craft of artisans. All would know the use of the mind and the hand in the development of the material of life, and all according to purpose established and understood. In the development of duty, the young learned the interconnection of community, to recognize what it was that betrayed man's love for his brother. In the development of fitness, all learned to recognize the battle between the battles. All learned that, each day, each minute, the battle proceeded against all that would defile, and that a battle must be fought with lean body of muscle that could run, fight, and climb, and a mind to match, all to pursue their view of the sky, all to reach to the heavens they envisioned. And that was the seeking of the silver light, for all heard and saw the depictions of angels, and nothing but that was allowed to be indulged. No more would the identification with life's diminishing grain be deified, invested in, allowed to cause the lowering of eyes. The raising of flesh would be through the lifting of eyes. No more would the gold of anything but the sun itself be allowed to distract and thereby be applied to rule. This time the sun itself would not be forgotten, and this time those of particular intelligence would not be corralled into pens of reconstructive learning. This time the intelligent would be spread to lift all sectors, every facet of the tribe, and thereby intelligence would not become mistrusted as rapacious. The intelligent would live where they grew, amongst those they knew, and thus their skill would serve all, and none would be left behind, and by that the tribe would know cohesion again. No more would it be that all would be considered equal, so to diminish, so to excuse. All were expected to excel in duty. Only in that were they to be considered equal, and any that served to break that duty were to be known and excised. That was the defense developed, employed, and expected. Just as the body protected itself, so would the mind, and so would the spirit. And so bodies were trained, and so minds were trained, and so spirits were trained, towards awareness, consideration, and active perpetual concerted response, and the reaching strands of darkness that would grasp and cling and feed while weakening their host, and all the thought that would patiently allow, that would train to accept, would be sought and removed and never more merely banished. As that had been tried, and memory was kept long, and the fires would be kept burning, and elders would speak of the sorrow that must henceforth be avoided. Now again man and woman each would stand tall and not be yoked like the burdened ox of the field, let alone left to tend into oblivion the machines of man's duty. And thereby the machines of man's duty would be developed, but slower, with more consideration, and for more limited application. Thereby the countryside would remain, and its people would be strong, and never would those engaged in man's duty forget their honour. Their home, too, would remain the farm and the wood, and never would their duty overreach. Their land and their cities, their farmers and their artisans would be kept pure, and thereby their arts would form and grow, and thereby their eyes would remain bright and filled with the colour of sky. That was the sight given, that was the beauty of the objective. But the shackled abroad stood firm and threatened this reproach of what they themselves had allowed. That power, the power of the lifting wings and the dragon's breath, the spread of the spawn, raised their heads and noticed that they were questioned and confronted. And so together they stirred. This power, regardless of relation, must be seen as but a threat. And to that force it was a threat, for it would have reclaimed the ground that their own supposed saviour had gained. No more was the temple to be sullied. The earth was the temple, Eden was the temple, the body of man was the temple, the mind of man was the temple, the connection of man to his memory of his father was his temple. The shackled had forgotten, they had allowed the shackles, accepted the shackles in their presumption that they could excuse themselves and buy their way into heaven through their greed. They forgot, they looked at only what was before them, only that which they had learned they could control. And so, for a promise, they had taken the gold, and it was then that the shackle was set. The promise was for the pound of flesh, and the cruelty was allowed. Man succumbed to sentiment that made all forget, that was designed to make all forget that the promise itself should have been considered unenforceable, by its very nature a contract unrecognized in law. And he that enticed it would meet Michael's spear, as memories had grown long and would not be forgotten. And so the world raised up against them to fight, and the paper of the contract, on which the ink had not even yet dried, had won, had displaced all that had been known for thousands of years. And so the wolves lost, and in the aftermath the dragon had, in that world, won. For the first time in 2,000 years it would employ its will unfettered. It was the ruler now. No more would it crawl and entice from shadows. And yet it would, for like the wolf, it too had not forgotten. Only the meek would forget, and the shackled kind. And they would be prevented from remembering. The cruel now would not lose again, and so they used the kind, and so they coddled the meek, and all the while their hidden riches grew. The cruel came to own all, the cruel came to rule all that fed the mind of man, and it would feed such as to entice, such as every day to temper harder the shackle that was born. And the meek wondered why they remained, amidst all of the apparent wealth, so hungry. And inside they missed the sky, but they had forgotten the sky, and so were left with the unexplained feeling alone. Their lives became as pallid as a vampire's skin. They lived as does the working dog when perpetually penned. They lived as the running dog set to treadmill to provide the power for another. Nevermore would that dog of the field feel the wind as he ran, never the hot flesh, never the satisfaction of the hunt in the muscle that drew his bone. But it was only the shallowest, conscious part of his mind that had forgotten. His deeper memory was contained in the structure of his fibre, but there it was maintained, there it was rendered unheard. And yet it was not mute. It spoke in the way it could, in the deep part of his brain, in his deepest now hidden instinct. And the kind relented, servant to the cruel, and comforted the meek, advised them in the meeting of their new-found world, explained that they must maintain the perspective that all was fine, even though they felt ill. They would be fed with an array of trinkets, with the appearance of those that once had been coveted. They too would be adorned, they too were special, they too were valuable, even while they starved, even while their minds festered in suppressed anger and suppressed discontent, they would be embraced. Their hands would be held, and all they need do is not complain too loudly and control themselves by not considering the vampire that fed from their neck. But they wouldn't consider the vampire. They had long been trained to forget the vampire, to consider the vampire as merely a character of no material meaning and even as a form of beauty. Stories of vampires shifted from a menace of concentrated darkness to a romantic, a desired enticer of souls, an archetype for the young to embrace. And meanwhile, the costs of the consumption grew, and another dragon from another land scented the amassed gold, and though once controlled, despite once stifled, thought still to slumber by now tamed, lifted his head, and then the battle of dragons would begin. One was older than the other, one was ancient, and his memory came back with the scent he once knew, the scent of consolidated power, the scent of control, the scent of concentrated wealth, heaven on earth with not a thought for the after, not a thought for the purpose, not a space for the lifting of souls, no time for the gazing light. The wolves were damned, remembered as but the great evil, and so those that remained bowed to their new lords, no longer the moon and forest, no longer the lean hunt of the pack, no longer the mother's duty. And so too was damned all that they stood for, the stern and the solemn, Michael's tribe, the force that kept order on earth. They were the mother's duty, for without them her beauty would vanish in her tangled, writhing hair. She maintained them, she fed them, they were her consort's gift. But now they were discredited. Those that for all time past had quelled the dragons of the land were enchained and eschewed, and their foe, those they had lived to chasten, deified themselves while proposing to hold no god but one. They became God on earth. They prepared the minds of man for war. They created the means by which to prevent man from questioning the course they invariably took. They provided the means for all. They laid waste to the land. They made men forget the freedom of the bird, for soon no birds were left. Soon the oceans would wither, and the fields, despite paper promises, would go dry, and a dust bowl would be made of fields that once had grown forever. To secure their hoard, and to ease their siphoning of man's blood, they had made man stupid. They had corralled him into boxes. They had thought their design impregnable. By it they would live forever, and all those that held gold would do so only through their allowance, and never would the debt be forgotten, and always it would be twice paid in return. But what was created in that time? What was the benefit that so cost the earth and men? Pretended ease. And thus it was cast about by the kind, who never wished to say what might be considered a negative word, that it was indeed the best time that man had known. Man had misunderstood something he dimly remembered. He was to look to brightness. Man, in his distraction, in the time of his loss, had allowed himself to consider that it was the feeling of brightness he required, regardless of whether it was warranted. And yet it was, to man, warranted, as his delight had come to live in responses to the basest of pleasure, the basest of consideration, the respite, the lack of the regard for cost. The dragon had become, the blood was stripped from the land, all that could be employed to entice, all that could be positioned to be consumed would be developed, extracted for, and consumed. And the costs mounted to the earth that once had fed the wolf and lamb, the elk and rabbit, the horse, raven, and lion. But those that stripped the land to transform it into gold, they knew nothing of what was lost, because their interest had been ever in gold, and never had they known the earth but through that lens. All that was best, the beauty of the provisioning world, was set to be transformed into waste, the byproduct of the transfiguration in the smelters of the dragon. And it was man himself that worked the mines, that felled the trees. And from cities of Babel towers, disguised by never so much as once had been required, their masters directed and provided their paper promise, and the kind explained to all that might question how it was the debt that had allowed all of what was had, and how it was the best time ever, and how all had been impoverished before, and how never had there been so little war. But it was a lie, for never still came a time in the absence of war, and the message could be sent through the paper that once was tree to condition man that he might willingly, even excitedly, call for his own blood to be spilled in the pursuit of the righteous course. And the enemy would be identified, and the people would be riled, and the blood would be siphoned towards the effort. It was the dragons that called for war. It was the dragons that held the treasures that kept the blood of man. It was the dragons that would provide the material for the armaments once they had been paid in blood, and it was the dragons that controlled the making of the armaments, and it was the dragons that paid with the blood of man in return for twice of what they had lent. But would the dragon fight? No, it had enslaved wolves for that, turned them into their own war dogs. But was it not but one enemy the dragon fought? Was it not his old rival, the one tribe left that had kept the vampire at bay, the one tribe left that had not forgotten that there was a sky above the desert? They alone rebelled once their older sibling was lost. Once again dragons set kin against kin, and in the time of the greatest expenditure on arms in the history of man, the kind explained that there had never been such peace, and none should worry, and meanwhile they, intently focused only on what they could control, and intently adamant to never see the rising dark, and intently firm in avoiding the bother of their rising instincts, they fed the old dragon with gold. And those that struggled to accept the lie, those that felt the discord, those whose senses could not be deadened, were told to thicken their skin, so that they too might resemble the pallid cold armor of the dragon. But those that so counseled did not know. Instead they took pride in their resilience against the burden. They took pride in their insisted ignorance, and gave prizes of fame to those who had seen, suffered, but not fallen through acceptance. They might be held up, they would be held up as heroes. Those who accepted unwavering the shackle would be the hero. And they would continue to toil, but this time they would not look abroad, and thereby find cause to question. They would not mind the injustice done, they would instead be quelled by the kind to accept the rule of the cruel. And so they that might have been stern, those that retained a glimmer of recognition of the solemn, were caused to be meek, and thereby they would know the empty praise, the worthless trinkets that they, enchained and beaten and alone, would accept, and their story would be broadcast as a triumph. And meanwhile the dragon siphoned from it all, from every intermediary stage, from every attendant factor, every single interaction that could be brought to bear. Blood would be spilled into the collecting cup, and the dragon's hoard would grow. And man, an animal with specific needs, governed by his history, governed by the very fact of his being, would fall ill. His flesh would rebel against the artificial, the fibre could not assume as did the dislocated mind, and so the fibre would rot, the bone would become brittle, the very teeth by which he ate would corrode, and all on the products that had been proposed to should satisfy, as would satisfy the mind that was dislocated from spirit. No longer would man look to the stars for wonder, for they had grown dark. No longer would he look to the sparkle of light in water, for the water, polluted, no longer allowed the light to pass. Only the light of dragon fire would be allowed. Only the flickering of the flame, casting shadows by the smoke that rose from the hidden ruin, would be allowed to catch in children's eyes. They would be enticed from birth into a world of trust that every need would be met, that their delight would not be ignored, and even when they fell ill, when the substance they required was forgotten, they were treated by the same dragons that had provided the poison, treated with the antidotes that were designed by those that had provided the poison, and all was provided in order to siphon. But the flickering passing shadows, within the smoke that rose from the burnt remains of all that the dragon fire touched, would prevent their ever seeing. And so they were told that all before was illness and death, and starvation of delight, starvation of the possibility of individual experience. No, only the dragon fire, only once the dragon fire had risen, only since then had the possibility for health been secured, and all thanks to those that provided the poison, that enticed away. Only they had allowed man the garden of expression he now knew. But there was an admission fee to the garden, and for each plant to be viewed there was another, and all the while the visitor would be monitored so that his delight could be measured, and thereby he could be provided with greater efficiency that which would cause him more easily to bleed. Entire industries arose to feed man's delight and his comfort, and man living in cities lost touch with the world that had forever fed him. He was told he was what was important, that he did not need the garden. Thus man expressed the dragon's resentment, that even the dragon did not recognize that it was it that at every stage had insulted precisely that which it claimed to love and honor. The resentment was in the banishment, and the cause was distorted ever after. The parents of the tribe did not draw anger through the pursuit of knowledge, for it was intended that they should have knowledge. That was the purpose of the garden, to foster the possibility for the meeting of potential. The banishment was for the path taken within that garden, for the desecration of it, for the desire to have it all despite the burden of the cost, in the expectation the cost could be avoided. The dragon was itself the offspring of the serpent that they proposed confronted man. They themselves were the force that Michael had been tasked to fight. The old man they proposed they followed, to whom they referred when casting themselves as the chosen, was the very force that they themselves had betrayed. For they deigned to create a garden of their own, one of waste and mined stone, but one with the appearance of delight, the shadow of the garden in which their supposed forebears grew. The difference was in that for which the garden sought, and thus, when allowed, produced. The deeper the unshackled mind sought, the more obscure the view became. The dragon had burned the books that spoke to what once had been known. They would never again be read, and so the origins became obscured. Man was to become his father by honoring his mother. That much was true. It was not that man was not to mimic the garden, to realize through that mimicking his potential, but the potential that was realized would reflect the extent of the mimicking mind. The dragon's garden mimicked in diversity of expression that all that could be born was born, and that all that could live would live, but only insofar as it could be bled. The tender stopped speaking. He gazed upon the windows of glass. The Valkyrie sensed his disquiet. The Valkyrie spoke. "Why do you pause?" The tender spoke. "Because it is difficult to accept that anything can be wrong. Man, whether led by dragon or otherwise, has created from what was provided, and I have never been one to believe that all are in a position to judge. And thus I have always allowed myself even the realization that there must be lords that govern man. In that ancient garden, is there not a flower for every insect or bird that feeds from it? Does not the garden produce for each different purpose and its alternate? Do dock leaves not always grow where nettles may be found? And if man does not allow the threat, then does he not lose the opportunity to learn how that threat may be confronted? And in the process of making even the unnecessary product, does he not thereby collect funds that may be employed towards that which might otherwise never be known? But it does not satisfy. There is a difference, and the difference is in the paths that are available to be followed. The garden the dragon creates, in order for his vampirism to feed, does not resemble the garden burned in order to create it. Man is capable of more. Every tool must therefore be compared to the simple, well-crafted violin. Every sound must be compared with the beauty the instrument may potentially create. I have heard the sound of angels, thus I may not be satisfied with that which would distract from the realization of that sound. It is not the dragon that sings the sound of angels. The dragon may allow it, to the extent it may profit, but it is not the dragon that sings. The dragon, even where allowing, will limit consideration, compartmentalize experience, such that the reason for hearing the voices of angels is disrupted. The angel song will not be allowed to breathe through the walls. It will not be allowed to negate the will for that which is less. Man learns instead that to be clean requires soap, requires medicine, requires the breaking free of the filth of the past. It is forgotten that once men bathed in streams and rivers, that he washed his face in the rain, and then warmed himself beside a different sort of fire, a fire around which the stories told were told by those he knew, those he had known forever. Those stories were not told simply to delight and distract. They were the story of that very person who listened. They were the stories that enriched his blood, the stories that guided him on so that his stories might continue to be told. No one was charging admission. The stories were not to entice towards the burning of the forest that provided the food. The stories were not designed to cause the listener to forget, but rather to remember, as only through remembering had the tribe survived. The dragon tribe, thus like any other, lives according to its way. It too has its own potential it must attempt to meet. The dragon tribe lives according to the rule that governs it. It will strive just as will those tribes of the wolf, or any others that compete in the world for their way. And the resources are there to be exploited and used. That is the way of nature too, and it is embodied in man. Nature seeks the blood of all that grows. Thus all that grows dies and is taken by soil to become again, to break apart and be distributed in whichever way nature as a whole and in that particular microcosm deems it required. But does all that grows truly die? Are there not ferns in the forest still? Did I not recently read of a forest of trees that all are the genetic replication of one? Individuals may quickly die, but the collectives of which they are a part may live on, and some live longer than others. And longer they live, the further they go in providing the extent of what they have to offer. The dragon hoards. The dragon does not look to tomorrow as others do. The dragon sleeps only when all the gold he can scent has been collected. It is in his being, in the fiber of his being, and just as he creates problems that he then addresses, all so as to feed, so too is he himself a problem for others to address and find solutions for. He represents a propensity. He represents the failure to appreciate that there is more. He represents the fundamental force of inertia. He knows he is not welcome beyond, so he clings to that which he deems he may control, and he clings with claws and with fear, and with visions depicted in the shadows amidst the smoke and flame. He resents, and so he will remain. This world shall be his short-sighted idea of heaven. All shall be transformed into gold. First, the matter of earth. By war that matter shall be owned, and by war man shall forget in his weakened state. He shall only remember the threat whispered to him to recall. Second, the matter of man. And by distracting word false need shall be raised, a desire shrouded in a sense of need, associated to it in the absence of memory. And by distracting word even the idea of diversified plenty would be subsumed. It would be disassociated from its root. It would become the non-living, a display in a museum, the butterfly wing represented, pinned alone and still, no longer to float, light upon breeze to land on green stem. The stem would be removed, the colors of the wing would become meaningless, their origin and reason to be excluded, but a fee now would be required to see it. The sole connective tissue the dragon knew was what its tribe kept in common, the love of fire, the melting down of gold in the absence of sun, the sparkle of gems in the absence of dew. The dragon remained in his mountain lair, the true image of his realm, the dark cave in which his true face was hid. And so all men were set to collect for the dragon's need, all men were allotted their space to collect, and all were expected to honor the paper, nothing that they held would ever more be theirs. The promises mounted, more was held than was owned, more was funded than could be afforded, man's thirst was stoked, his expectation was inflated, he would believe that he deserved. And so all that he did was owned before achieved, and all on a promise of flesh. Man was thus enslaved. He drew from the earth, extracted all that he might extract, and he extracted from others all that might be extracted, and even his children were exposed, because if man could allow himself to give even his own, then surely he had been right to give himself. The giving of children thus came to itself be justification for the betrayal of his very own life. And so the children grew, not to expect the tilling of fields, the climbing of trees, or the running amongst his tribe of the hunt. They grew instead to understand their freedom as consisting of their simple ability to consume according to their will, to express all that might be expressed, regardless of whether or what the expression served. They were trained to give blood since birth. Never was their blood their own in the life they would ever know. Consumption would be their god. They would consume so that the dragon could gain, all would feed the dragon's will to hoard. Never again would man rely on having only that which he himself could carry. Such was the enticement. To forego the consumption was to forego the duty, and man had promised, been bound by paper that governed his course, ever to give his blood. Thus never could man have enough, as he joined the vampirous tribe, as servants. The more he could collect, and thereby pass on, the more he was rewarded and incentivized to fight, ever to gain more. Thus the dragon won the once intelligent. They would be corralled, they would charge the more, for a pyramid of form existed by which the dragon would mine. Only he, the chosen, would call home the invisible heights. Beneath were those that had been turned to his will. At the top of those were those captured that would most effectively serve. They were those that, spread amidst their own as once they had been, would have not lost the connection from which tribes had been maintained. Now, in the absence of those, in the form of the pyramid instead of the form of overlapping sphere, they would think solely of themselves, in service of masters, and in mimicry of their masters' never-quenched greed. And so they would gain their mansions, even palaces. They were those that were seen, they ran the companies, they were the prominent few, and meanwhile the masters remained hidden. And beneath those prominent few were those that served with capability within the mechanism. They were spurred by ideals of work that stemmed from watching seasons pass, wherein seed would be planted such that their own family might live through winter. And they would be afforded a carriage and timepiece by which others might know that they strove. And they were bound by paper so that what they earned was never quite enough, and they were shown what was more, that by their striving they might prove themselves worthy of further chains. And those below them were allowed the meagre, artificial scraps that they might always be kept hungry, despite their exhaustion, despite their sense of loss. Their expectation was disallowed, they worked simply to continue to live in service. And beneath those were those that provided by the basest coin, for they were the base of the pyramid, and though individually they might be allowed to die, in numbers they together offered much, and with no chance of power. They were held for cheap, their blood was to the dragon that of the rat, but it was still of use. That gold could be used. It was not rich gold, not the purest gold, but it could be used to pay for much in the gaining of those who had forgotten how to discern. And so the lowest paid for the second lowest, and the second lowest paid for the next, and each with his diminished gold was turned to diminished gold by the dragon. And the dragon then paid for none, but collected from all until it had distilled from all that was of value. Those at the bottom never more even glimpsed gold, then those above the same, then those above the same. Once it was that man had no need, living in roaming tribe. That which was of use was traded, and the only way to achieve it was through work. The dragon tribe, once committed to slavery, committed never again to be so chastened, never so diminished. They rejected the lesson they had been set to learn. The path to freedom would be instead in the intervening element, and so it was to that they forged their minds. The interest thus was never more in the goods themselves, but in the trade, and so the means of currency must be held. And that currency would be the trinkets that man could be encouraged to admire, and no longer would be the materials and the spirit that man required to actually build. And so the furs were collected, not to keep warm, but so to incite the desire for more. Silver paid for the ships that carried the slaves, silver paid for the goods that had been taken, and then it was the promise of gold, and then just the paper itself, and then just digits on a screen representing the value of the man to the dragon, the expression of the regard in which he was held, did he serve the dragon or not. All of the gold was gone, hidden away and lost, and no one saw the sun through a clear sky again. The Valkyrie spoke. You referred to another dragon tribe. The tender spoke. To the dragon all there is the gold. The vampire is just another story to represent the siphoning of gold, to represent those tribes that maintain that way as their own. The blood represents the energy of man, the life force that he bears, the essence of his potential. What he once gave in blood, what he once earned in blood, in influence and in recognition of value, the blood of the hunter, the blood of the tribe, the blood of elder and of king, he came to represent in gold. Only the wolves fully remembered the blood. Only they remained pure, and they valued their blood, as they, remaining true to their mother and true to their father, the old grey, they remained lean and strong. They preferred the silver of moon. The silver represented the acceptance of what was more, the recognition of the sun, the satisfaction with but silver. The preference reflects the recognition of a hierarchy of soul, that there is always further to which to reach. Thus the wolf maintains, thus the wolf allows the life of the garden, and maintains it rather than desecrates it through raping extraction. The parents of dragons did not so govern themselves, and thus too offspring were born, who would recall and embody that which was to be saved, and he who would give birth to the dragon kind. In their descendants those traits were maintained, through their descendants those traits battled. The dragon kind learned from their birth that all was theirs. The wolf kind learned from their birth that they were to husband, that the old garden might blossom. The dragon kind saw only what they valued, and so all that they could not see was allowed to go to waste. The wolf kind tended by maintaining the balance of all. The king rules the wolf pack, but all are strong and fast, and so too must therefore be their prey. And never did the wolf enslave, Never did the wolf admit for the weak, but the dragonkind were different in realizing their control through fear of the fire they breathed. They approximated themselves in their arrogance to the sun. And so others, rather than stand tall, were set in weakness to worship and serve, to provide always to the dragon. And so to live they embraced their fear, embraced their weakness, appreciated the respite from the testing, challenging wolf. They traded their freedom, they traded their blood for a promise of immediate realization of life. The debt they bore would hold them and would be the foundation for the future of their children. For always with dragon tribes the costs accrue, and always a dragon is paid. The more the darkness of the presumption mirrored the strength of the appearance of the sun, the further and wider those dark strands reached, the greater was the ensnaring. For a misguided taste of heaven on earth, their offspring would suffer. They would grow from birth in the shackling world. They would never have that memory of freedom. They would never know how the fruit of the earth once tasted. The stars in the smoke rising from the dragon's breath would dim. Never would the gleaming silver of moon shine again. Nothing would be known but the burning sun and a desert where once had been a garden. But man would not see. Too distracted by the shifting shadows across his prison walls, he would delight and embrace and encourage, and he would have no choice, because if he did not, then he would die. All sustenance was the providence stemming from the control of the dragon horde. The garden had been enclosed. No longer did the garden know the sun. The dragon and the delights it provided, and the weaker and weaker food, the weakest it could be designed to be, would be the only sun that was seen. Thus contracted were the eyes of man, and all else within the dragon power. The tender paused, and the Valkyrie, singing in her light, waited. The tender spoke again. In the old world, a great desert exists. It reaches across a continent. That desert was once a garden that came to be ruled by dragons. Now but few remaining sources spring to overcome the desolation wrought by the dragon lust. The dragon lust gives to that which serves, and only so long as it serves. Those that are brought to serve are considered the kind, because they entice by means provided to the will of the gold, all to give their blood. They are the providers of order. They, to be effective, to manage their seduction, must embody the inviting. They embody the security sought. They are the veneer that keeps man from remembering what was lost. But to the dragon they represented more. They are the structure by which the dragon siphons. They are the irrigation channels that run with the blood of man to feed the fields of the dragon's gold. You, Valkyrie, daughter of the spear, asked after that other dragon I mentioned, that dragon that wolf had chastened. That dragon awoke enticed, and those of the land it ruled held no wolves. They remained the offspring of the kept. Siphoned from them to hold power was a benevolent order of governing structure. But there too the structure was to feed, and it held until heroes of wolves came and did not recognize the fear and walked through the fear that caused others to quiver. And they humbled the dragon, removed its gold so that it would sleep. Dragons exert the strength of the gold they hold. The gold is their life force, and they wither without, but always potential is latent. Dragon tribes learn over time to control, and that old tribe would use the resources of the horde that had developed as it slept to humble all, and then the younger of dragons would wish he had not allowed the wolves to die. The older dragon would bleed the younger dragon. The older dragon recognized patience in the time he had known. But the younger dragon remained thrilled in its singular lonely significance. Indeed, it was the younger dragon that sought to wake the older so that it too might be enslaved. The younger dragon could not even see itself, let alone what it woke. It saw land and people, it recognized the offspring of slaves, and so it treated them, and so it put them to work. Old slaves were forgotten, another garden rent and sullied and allowed to die. The next would profit them more, and the gold was all that mattered. And so, in that land that was an empire, where no rule lived that could compete, the dragon saw the raw and those that would be its slaves. As I said before, the scent of gold awoke the dragon, but realizing itself awakening, it bided its time and learned what it had missed as it slept. The younger dragon had employed its wolf slaves effectively, and its own ancient gift of fire had been developed in its absence, but the younger dragon had grown heedless in the extent of its unchecked power. It lacked in its voraciousness a remembrance that it was not the first, and what happened to another could happen to itself. The younger dragon had extended itself too much, assumed as it dug too deep. Its grip on its slaves had become weak, precisely because it stripped them too far. They had become, as had once its own slaves, volatile in their ignorance, in their disconnection. They flowed like unconstrained water allowed into the hold of a ship. The old dragon would not be again so careless. The wolves it grew again to maintain would be kept leaner, sharper, more focused on the dragon's cause. The slaves would not be allowed to look away. Their blood would be more carefully maintained and channeled. The dragon would compartmentalize all into a stricter form, and would entice its younger rival with a potential that younger dragon could not ignore. And it did not ignore. It was not that it did not see any potential for threat, but in its pride it did not see the fullness of that threat until too late. It assumed its power, it thought its predominance complete, it thought its rule could be taken for granted, and thus it found itself bled. The world had become small in the years since those dragons had been born. The elder had felled the wolves the sooner, the younger was just beginning to know its prime. And as is so often the case with an empire of man, the apex is realized only once it has passed. A time comes when the extension is realized to be too great, and then the core is discovered to have grown soft, the wolves are shunned in the comfort of power, and the people forget what allowed their ease. The ease the wolves were to bring was to be used for the extension of man's mind, and the longer the wolves held the ground, the longer they had to realize the allowance of that extension. But that was not the dragon's plan, for the dragon knew that given all factors potentially at play, it would not be the dragon's way that would be chosen. Indeed, the dragon remembered his own shunning. He remembered when wolves, unafraid, in their solemnity of fire, removed the gold, spread it, and enclosed him in the darkness of his sleep. And he remembered when the wolves isolated, shunned, or killed him for the destabilizing force that he embodied. So long as man knew the wolf, so long as man remembered, the dragon kind would be hated. The living man would not suffer what he remembered to abhor. It became a question of breeding, the breeding of man. And the older dragon there held advantage, for his subjects had gone longer without knowing the dignity they once held. The younger dragon had only more recently known the success the older had known for 1,000 years. The younger dragon had gained its power by setting wolves against wolves, by whispering enticements, by whispering provocations, and the eldest of man still remembered what was before the wolves had been lost. They remembered the wolf blood in their own veins. They remembered how they had grown. They remembered what it was to know. They could not, in the aftermath of the war, in the desolation of the trauma, in the indignation of the perceived affront, keep at bay the unbridling of that which had always been kept at bay. The dragon paper was to be held by all. None would themselves ever see the sun again. That was the cost of the loss. The cost was the shackling of all, and none would dare ever again to question. By the harm done, by the foundational training to abhor cruelty, regardless of what it served, by the adoption of the relativist, subjectivist mind, by the enabling of false notices of equality, by the pretending the brotherhood of all, by the deification of freedom, the dragon had set the stage. Man was primed, and the dragon knew it. The dragon knew all it had to do was light the tinder, and all would go ablaze. The response never would be forgotten, and the dragon, impervious to the fire it itself wrought, would be impervious. It would sacrifice its own young so to draw the world it gripped ultimately to its cause. And so it devalued the paper. It flooded the markets with devalued gold and made worthless the paper, and then took hold of its security. The last nation of wolves that held the dragon power at bay would starve. The wolves would erupt with indignation. They would make their final stand, and they would lose, for then the gold would flow, and the wolf would be discredited, for in the eyes of man, who had been trained by the paper he studied, which enticed and betrayed, the wolf had been made to seem cruel, when in fact it was cruelty the wolf existed to combat. Solemnity, the carrying of silver in respect of sun, was discredited. Man would embrace the shallow, the pleasure, the veneer. Man would believe all was good. Man would despise the judgment that had ever protected him against precisely what then seduced him. And quietly, behind the veil, the dragon removed the evidence of the past. What could not be forgotten would be ridiculed in caricature. And so, encouraged to distraction, man would take pride in blindness. In a sense of idealistic presumption, man would dismiss his entire past as a work of manipulation by the cruel, by the wolf, that evermore must be shunned, just as the wolf had shunned the dragon, and thereby been made the ultimate hero of the people. There was a reason that dragon slayers were the heroes of man, a reason that they, above all, were placed foremost in the pantheon of man. But man would forget why in their failure of sight. They would learn to think of the dragon only in its mythical and thus unreal context. They wondered if dragons ever really existed. They thought of the stories as they thought of their own, as entertainment, as passing delight, as of no more import beyond their amusement. But like all stories of their kind, the dragon stories were warnings. All that had changed was the ability of people to see beyond the veil, that the dragons were all around and in themselves and hidden away in caves, that no one might ever know the true extent of their power, that for hundreds of years they had worked for this day, preparing the ground, establishing the reliance, making sure through control of thought that the required response, the silent coup, would know success. Thus they sacrificed their young for the prize. Thus they showed their capacity. Thus they showed the extent of their resentful drive, and meanwhile one would develop a breath of fire with the power to burn a city with a single gust. And thereby another distant tribe of wolves that they could never hope to control would succumb in shock with a trauma that would remain in the fibre of their expression evermore. That tribe was the one that had been set to keep watch over that older dragon that by then had been set to sleep. The dragon burned the guard set to watch the cage. Hagen thus set Olbericht free, and in that story it was not correct to portray the giant of man as a dragon. The giant was the servant of the dragon. The giant, struck by the curse, appeared as a dragon. The dragon was the appearance of the curse. The hero slayed the dragon. The hero did not fear the curse. The hero stepped through the fire and there found the pure form he had forgotten, the embodiment of his mother's will. That was the world into which the old dragon woke. A world in which the wolves that had set him to sleep had been vanquished, and the upstart was at war with the remaining, that one last tribe that held out. It would watch the last wolves bleed, and it would watch the enslaved once again fight amongst siblings, ever failing to see all that mattered. Once again wolves were portrayed as those that incited fear, and man who once had deified the dragon slayer, seen him as second only to their singular god, now associated his fear with that of the dragon, which knew to fear the wolf as a wolf would expose the lie. And so man, through paper treaty, through his training, through learned expression, cut off from elders' stories, would fight against that which they should have been fighting for. For what expressed more perfectly that remaining tribe, that tribe of tribes, other than solemnity and austerity and the ability to live lean? Were they not the descendants of those who witnessed the desolation, the turning of garden to desert? They had remained as lean in that desert as had the wolves of the north in their frozen forest. Only they could live where they lived. They remembered the springs, and from one to another they would go, with the hot breath of the sand-heated wind to remind them ever of the dragon's breath, to remind them ever of their cities that fell, and then, hidden beneath, would never be seen again. The dragon missed them. They amassed nothing sufficient to attract. Not until the hordes of decomposed dragons had been found, the black gold that would draw the eyes of men back to their forgotten world. Those people, that tribe, poor but for sand, the stars, and the carcasses of the dragons that with nothing left to collect, were taken by the sand and suffocated in the waste that they themselves had created. But they, clinging to the ways by which they had survived, were called the threat. Standing before the wealth, the wrath of the world, they were considered the threat. They whose golden age was called so for its learning was considered the threat. They that would not allow the bloodletting of their children were considered the threat. And those that had offended all were handed the reins of power, and they had returned, and they sought the gold that they knew was there beneath the sand. And with that black gold they would burn the forests and make black the sky, and man, their servant, would feed evermore the dragon thirst. Man's world would change with the influx of the black gold. It was then the pace shifted, then the next stage would develop. First it was the stationing of man on farm, then man no longer climbed, then it was the city where man forgot that he once ran. And then it was the industry fueled on the flesh and blood of dragons, and then it would be what man would create to appease his master's need to ever further control, the distillation and harnessing of man's soul directly. Man would be called, man would have nothing left to offer, and the world that once supported him would shrink. The dragons would live alone with their slaves and with the technology that would provide the means to know all that passed, all that might threaten. And through that technology, man would be ranked, rated, and destroyed. The dragon would be the vampire again, and man provided the means. In the cause of the provision of man's adopted desire, man would create his own nemesis. The dragon was given the map of man's mind. All that man had learned, all that he was, and all that he might be would be known and written into the dragon's hide. Never again would man threaten. Never again would the wolf blood be allowed to rise. The dragon would own all, and so the dragons went to war, quietly at first. Both knew that the one that could control men to its will the better would win, and both knew that only one would remain, one would fall to the sand. The elder of the two had become the upstart, and it would watch the younger bleed in its folly. But the younger would fight, and between them that which men might have been would be lost. The ties to the past had been severed. The Valkyrie spoke. Is it not that some who live maintain the ties to remember? The Tender spoke. I have noticed that some have seen that we fought on the wrong side of the war. The Valkyrie spoke. Tell me of what you have seen. The Tender spoke. When things do not turn out as we expect, as hoped for, we have a choice. We can blame it on something else while maintaining our position, or we can just move on while wisely focusing only on the present, or we can consider what exactly it was that went wrong. And if we choose the latter of those, then we can consider who was it that argued for the path that now it is apparent would have been the better path to take? Who was it that correctly saw the threat? The consideration of hindsight is easily dismissed as a reference in excusing the carelessness that only with hindsight could be seen. But excuse only even potentially holds where the folly was not explicated at the time. Where the course was urged at the time to be avoided, then the person, viewing with hindsight, as a matter of honest consideration, would have to consider what the principal structure was that he held that allowed him to overlook what proved to be the more correct path. And the person must further consider, unless he wishes to maintain the possibility for excuse, that the principal structure that caused the fault is certain to have provoked other faults. So what other distortions exist, whether latent or realized, that also may be attributed to that same folly? And further, if the principal structure has contained faults that can rightly be considered systemic and severe in their manifested costs, then the honest must ask, is the adherence to the principal structure one of insight and reason, or one of blinded loyalty? And if he adheres after discovery of the proven failure of insight and reason, then it must be considered, what is the source of influence that causes the person to adhere? Is it simply a matter of lethargy, laziness, and inertia, or is it something more active? And then the question must be asked, was there anything that gained from the course that was taken, and to what extent were those gains defrayed by losses borne? As the structure has proved costly in time, then it must be accepted that costs arose. So who benefited the most, and who bore the bulk of the costs? I mean, before even considering the past, where something in the present is being clearly damaged before one's eyes, the simple question is, whose enrichment resulted in that damage, and when did they garner the power to cause such damage by instigating their preferred policies? And who attempted to stand against them, if anyone tried, and when was the last time someone tried? Has there even been a voice in opposition? There is always a voice in opposition, though that voice can be faint at times when weak, or stronger at times when indignancy has arisen, before it gets shut down again, or finally catches the enlivened tender such as to cause a change. So I had to ask, what is it that caused man to so deplete the garden that he was intended to tend? Is it satisfactory to just blame nasty oil companies and nasty individuals that wish to extract and don't care about the dolphins or whatever? Was it satisfactory to just stop there and be satisfied? It was not. That which has depleted the garden is overpopulation by overconsuming humans. A person could be satisfied with that and move on with the thought that they themselves are of the valuable, and therefore their needs justify their consumption, but that would not be satisfactory. Why are there too many humans? What does their consumption consist of? What exactly is it that gains by the numbers and by the consumption? Is the force that argues for humanity and development while depleting the garden a beneficent force? Or is it stealing from the future in order to provide in the present? What exactly is provided? For what exactly did we give up on the value lost? We gave up the value for products and services. But what is the percentage of those products and services that are desire-based as opposed to need-based? Entire industries with attendant supply chains exist that are extraneous to need. How many soaps are required when hot water will adequately clean almost everything that in the basic household needs to be cleaned? If dishes can easily be washed clean with hot water, why does there need to be those millions of plastic bottles full of dish soap produced every day in the world? Those bottles are manufactured from materials that must be extracted and prepared and delivered. The soap the same, all along the line from oil field to laboratory to manufacturing facility, to shipping carriers, to warehouses, to whole armies of logistics workers, to retailers, to waste sites, and of the buildings and machinery and all their attendant parts and services, all to produce a product that is simply, literally not required. Why do people simply not have one bar of soap at their sink that is only used in the event of particularly insoluble oils? And it will be said that soaps are required to decontaminate, to kill germs, yet dogs drink from puddles in the street. Their immune systems remain resilient. Man biologically is barely different from a dog. So we have soaps and disinfectants to clean and sterilize everything, and then our immune systems suffer, and then we have entire medical industries to make up for the loss. And yet, for millions of years, literally hundreds of millions of years, our forebears survived. By definition, our lineal ancestors survived without the benefit of it all, at least long enough to reproduce. We are the descendants of the strongest, those that didn't die, and yet now we cannot exist with strength without a plethora of medications and treatments. And all of the packaging, the development, the facilities involved, all of the attendant supply chains, both primary and secondary, direct and indirect, all must be created to allow what was already pre-existing. Why? Why? So that people may live longer, healthier lives. That is the answer given, and it is inadequate. Why must people keep buying clothes when their others are not worn out or even threadbare? So that they can express their shifting individuality. That is the answer given, and it is inadequate. What would cause a shift from the expression of individuality being in the eyes, and in the speech, and in the body's movement, to being in the logo on a t-shirt and a drawer of a dozen? But to be fair, it is the female that is more susceptible in this regard. In the case of cosmetics, another universe of entirely unnecessary products, all are designed to pretend. Lipstick designed to portray the engorged vulva of the ape, blush to portray the exerted life force where otherwise there would be none, and others to pretend healthy skin where the diet is producing unhealthy skin, eye makeup to make dead eyes appear bright. People used to have hard floors, which could be swept with a broom or a dustpan and brush, and rugs that could be beat out on a line strung outside. But then people wanted carpeting. Every square inch needed to be soft. Sweeping was too much work, so vacuum cleaners had to be designed, and all of the raw materials had to be accessed, and all of the attendant parts had to be manufactured, and then the machine had to be assembled, packaged, and shipped. And we mustn't forget that all of the buildings in which all that would take place would need to be constructed with steel and concrete and everything between. 2 times the city to the south burned and was rebuilt using the lumber that once was an ancient forest of fog giants. And all for what? Ease and economic growth. Or rather, economic growth on the basis of the leveraged promise of ease. How many disposable pens are thrown away every day after their ink has dried, or even before? What happened to pencils and to reservoirs of ink paired to a single nib? Did they so dissatisfy? I alluded to armies of doctors engaged to prescribe medicines to solve problems brought about through obvious folly. But what about lawyers and police? Does not the sheer size of those industries suggest an underlying problem of the communal self-governance? Or a problem of the simultaneous encouragement of artificial representation of individualistic expression in an ever-tightening, ever more compressed environment? What force would balance the interests of the society to establish itself in such a way? Only that which benefits from it, and that which can be made to think that it benefits from it. So what does benefit from it to the greatest extent while avoiding the costs to the greatest extent? What practices allowed the growth? The holders of capital, those that profit, the investment of capital, that which fueled the growth in order to profit. The investment of control through education and the distribution of resources, all designed to incite behavior that will create the opportunity for profit. But they will say that they are providing jobs and growing the economy and increasing the standard of living, and that shall be all that shall need to be said. What has made it all possible? Hoards of gold have made it all possible. Highly efficient mechanisms to shift funds to where they might be most efficiently employed has made it possible. And how are hoards collected? By siphoning off the system of interactive activity in place. Profit is a reward garnered after costs are taken into account. If a hoard has been developed, then it was collected out of a system of interaction that allowed it. Expenditure of value requires an expression of valuation. Valuation is based on the educated state of the valuer. That state is trained by experience of the world that has been known. That experience is governed by the forces of influence that act upon it. Those sources of influence, to the extent they are efficient, reflect their own interests in the result of their expenditure of influential forces. And so people are trained as to what they are to value, and thus what they are to feed, and thereby promote. So what are those influential forces? Are all indeed equal just because the government is named a democracy, or just because the system of trade is called a free market, or just because everyone is created equal under God? Or do hoards exist? And how many are there, and how large do they get to be? And do we hear of some more than we hear of others? To what extent can that development of the world we know be attributed to which? And should all be taken individually, or can different hoards be seen collectively in light of their overlapping interests? The development of any hoard requires an imbalance of negotiating strength, whether within a single enterprise or entity, or between the producer and the purchaser. In the extreme and over time, the beneficiaries in this world have been those that control the finances of nations that have achieved such power that they profit from every stage and every aspect of the growth or contraction of the economy that they created. And where apparent need has been met, the limits of the economy are met, and therefore new needs must be developed. And the more transactions that can be made in the process, the more may be garnered from the effort. The extent of actually held wealth in the consuming populace is not enough. That too is a limitation, and so it must be met, and so people are enticed and then empowered with credit. They are allowed to borrow from their future selves for interest. It is no secret, though it is now a little-known fact, that usury, the lending of money for interest, is a pernicious practice and was disallowed in the two major custom sets of the last 2,000 years of Western civilization. And it is not a meaningless coincidence that the wars of the last 1,000 years have been fueled by funds lent for interest. And it is not a meaningless coincidence that the acceptance of the one tribe that upheld usury as a custom into the practices of one of those powers corresponded with the accelerated growth of the industry that has done such damage to the environment of man. And it is not a meaningless coincidence that two major wars were fought in response to that growing influence. Nor that, in the aftermath of those wars, when that one tribe that maintained those customs attained its ultimate ascendancy, the full scale of its expansion could be realized. It was realized through consumption and the generation of a marketplace that was trained simultaneously to an ever-expanding expectation and an ever-diminishing experience of satisfaction. And all the while those within the marketplace grew leaner and more distracted, such that the path of technological development that he himself fed through his labor grew such as to make him obsolete. The vampire does not represent some sort of fantastical being that sucks the blood of victims in Transylvania. The vampire is the allegorical representation of the usurer. The blood represents gold. It represents life energy, the ability to live. The victim of the vampire does not die immediately after being bitten and fed from. The vampire, if efficient, maintains his victim where useful to do so. The vampire is not satiated. His lifespan is long and his life is on earth. There is no heaven to which he will go. He doesn't believe in rebirth. The vampire is not Buddhist, no matter how many retreats he pretends to absorb. The vampire lives for himself, for what he is, for what he will always be. The creditor wants his debtor to live and earn so that he may continue to be paid. What he does not want is for his debtor to ever come to no longer require his capital. Credit card holders currently are paying interest on $1 trillion in debt in this country alone. And that is high interest. That is not your 3% on a mortgage or whatever those cost these days, nor 7% on a car or whatever those cost these days. A relatively small handful of banks issue credit cards, and those banks are owned by an even smaller number of interests. There are 4 or 5 private equity companies that own major stakes in all of them, and in all else, all of the major industries and their supply chains, and even those equity groups are owned by each other. The largest shareholder of the second largest of them is the largest of them, and the largest shareholder of the first of them is the second. And those companies themselves are owned, but although man hears of the wealth of individual entrepreneurs, or of particularly successful manufacturers, man never hears much about those that own it all. They hear nothing of the companies that own the bulk of the shares in those companies they hear about, not to mention also their competitors, and the organizations that advise them, and those which provide them their materials, and those which ship their goods, and those which work to design the framework of laws that will govern them, and those which own the companies that will inform people of what they should be thinking about and how, and on both sides of the argument. Every single penny that passes through the system is taxed by those that own it all and siphon another's drop of blood. And with that hoard, new technology and services may be developed, by which trades might be analyzed by devices that can beat the greatest of chess masters with ease, and which can do so in milliseconds. Where then is the parity in the negotiation in the marketplace, and what has all that development been used for? I will be the first to appreciate the existence of an old forest when all others were cut down, and I will gladly realize the only reason it remained was that it was set aside as a hunting ground for a king. Hoards can be employed to a variety of ends. So, what has the hoard built on the back of unbridled usury in the last 100 years been in aid of? Cultural and collective dislocation and disaffection as a result of a steeping in media designed to distract all as far as possible towards the nonsensical. And all so as to remove people ever further from their strict perception of need, ever further in the direction of consumption regardless of need, and all on the back of an extractive model that sees the environment, the garden, Eden, as material to be transformed according to the human will, regardless of cost, regardless of the future of man, and all in strict avoidance of deep consideration, all in the designed limitation of deep consideration. Man, so as to generate hoards for dragons, is made fat and stupid and distracted. He is to be made easily amused. He is to abhor anything that might threaten the undergirding rule, that he must perceive himself as free. He must place freedom above all. He must wear the shackle as a badge of honor. He is so free that he chooses to wear the shackle, because the shackle provides his freedom, or at least the promise of it. And through that shackle that provides his freedom, he no longer need even think of when he needs more milk. His refrigerator will monitor his use, and it will relay that information to its service provider, and he will be told when he needs more milk. And he will be told how many steps in a day he should take, and he won't even have to sweep his floor. Indeed, he won't even have to vacuum. An automated robot will do that for him, after having mapped and relayed the floor plan of his house. And meanwhile, another device shall listen to all that takes place and will learn everything there is to know about the inhabitants of that abode, and any questions that are asked of it shall be provided according to protocols. And so the family need never to wonder about a thing. They can just be told. They thus have freedom even from wondering. They are free from having to engage in what it takes to ride a horse without falling. They are free from having to exercise concentration, balance, and strength, let alone sensitivity and empathetic response to an animal. Indeed, the carriage now has no need of horses, nor even of the man it contains. It will drive itself, and it will relay information about the journey, and will record and relay all of what happens within the car as well, so that others may know all about all of the passengers, so as to be able to make their lives easier, so as to give them the freedom to live their lives to the fullest, those lives that no longer consist of much of anything. But their lives do consist of something. They are made free so that they may ingest that which they enjoy, that which they have been trained to enjoy. Food for their mind that is as designed, artificial, and lacking in any depth of nutrition, just as the food they eat for their bodies. And all of it must be paid for, first up front, but then also as part of a subscription service. It is no longer adequate to pay once. Not when man can be made to pay even more every month. But that is to the consumer's benefit, because they are free from having to think about it. It will, for the consumer's convenience, automatically be billed to their credit card, which, as we may recall, is also owned by the same enterprises as the service provided. How many times in one transaction does a single user pay for his drugs? As many times as possible. But it will be hidden from him so that he may be free from the inconvenience of having to think about it. And all of the information gleaned about him and his wife and his children and everyone he knows will be collected and mapped. And the freeing system will know so much that he will then be free from even having to work, as the system shall do it for him. And then he shall be free of that too. His body won't be required because new robots exist that are stronger and faster. And his mind won't be required because an artificial version was created that is far smarter and much more capable, which will leave him free to do absolutely nothing, which is what he will think of doing once his life has been whittled down to nothing, once the world outside is gone, once his mind has been trained to vacuity and its brevity. He will be free to be amused, while retaining the capacity for nothing more, and then he, obsolete and irrelevant, already dead, shall die. Who saw the perniciousness in the trait that upholds usury? Who argued to be wary of its effects? Is it really simply the case that those of generations past, for no reason other than ignorant cruelty, made a pattern of responding negatively against precisely those that, since allowed, have torn apart the fibers of concerted civilized existence? Were they just stupid back then? Or is it the case that, as more recently, those with perfectly reasonable views can be counted as xenophobic or paranoid and then simply dismissed? Can it be found that there were no people capable of considered reason prior to 100 years ago? Or is it to be remembered that it is more than 2,000 years since Plato lived, and that literature, philosophy, mathematics have all existed since then, and portrayed intelligence exceeding any but the greatest of contemporary capability, and in the cases of some, intelligence that exceeds almost any of any time? How many Goethes, Bachs, Plotinuses live today, and how many Alfarabis? Do not generals today still read the works of their forebears in the classical world? How much really has changed? Were those of the past the descendants of those who survived, and still rooted in the innate survival instinct, and still enmeshed within family and tribe? Were they really so clearly wrong to banish or kill people with whom, in concert with whom, they had lived? Why? What brings man to such a severe response? The answer is in the stories of vampires, and in the stories of dragons amassing and guarding hordes, the wealth of the land taken and held while the countryside starves. And what does it take for a dragon to abandon his hoard? No dragon will easily abandon that which it most loves, that which it must have in order to live, in order to feel satisfied in its sense of itself as the chosen. It takes a hero who is unafraid of fire. It takes a figure such as the Archangel Michael, or such as St. George, or of the knights of the stories in Mallory who take it upon themselves to rid lands of the evil forces within them that hold them hostage to their cruel, vile will. It takes Siegfried. It takes that sort of character. It takes Parsifal himself. It takes he who is so ignorant of cruelty that he does not consider not responding against what is clearly wrong. It takes he who is so stupid that he thinks nothing of meeting the dragon head-on with spear. That is when the paper is burned, and all retrieved so that the people may grow to breathe again. And only then is the weight they unknowingly carried removed, such that they feel as if weightless, and find they can run again. Only then are they reminded of what it was they once felt, the depth of the connected space between the stars, and the feeling of hearing the forest breathe. Is the thief that steals by lawful guile any different from the thief that steals according to his lesser capability? Do not all act according to their will and means? Is the thief not chastised when caught? Is he not sectioned? Is he not banished? And if he has gone too far, if he has caused devastation, and if banishment would be immoral, should he not be imprisoned that he cannot just carry on to do the same again elsewhere? And if imprisonment would be immoral, as who really rightly wishes to keep anything in cages, and especially not for long, then is it not more humane for all involved simply to execute for the offense? Is it not that in the traditions of justice consideration is given to the mind of the offender? Is not intent a factor in judging the extent of the offense? And what about empathy for the victims? Surely that is precisely the consideration behind the removing of the reins, that thereby allowed all that has taken place in the last 100 years. First, the allowing of conditions, and then the acceptance, the unquestioned acceptance of that which would grow in the conditions allowed. Who saw it? At the critical intersection, the critical choice of paths, who was it that voiced most vehemently the warning that went unheeded? Was it some fool that no one had reason to listen to? Was it a voice lacking credibility, lacking capability, lacking discipline and a sense of solemn purpose? Was it a culture that never had achieved anything of note? Or was it a culture that produced, for hundreds of years, some of the most considered works of beauty and intelligence as had then been known to man? Could it be that supposedly barbarous tribe that produced Hildegard, Bach, Beethoven, Jung, and the medieval guilds of craftsmen that wished to maintain the community that they had so rightly learned to value? Was it not that people, annihilated by wolves led by dragons, that was sucked dry and had finally had enough? Was it not their very culture that was a threat from a force that others had profoundly, foolishly succumbed to? Was it not the holders of the chains that attached to the shackle that they recognized? Were they not beset, and did they not value freedom when they rebelled against the rule of unbridled usury in the form of international finance? Had they not just experienced, once again, the effect of that finance when their own national economy was destroyed by that very force from abroad? And were not its proud, resolute, but weakened people starving? Were they those who had resisted even the indulgence, and whose history was so rich in enlightened aspiration? Were they not worth listening to when they argued against the falling of art to the base, to the moronic, to regression? Were they wrong to see the shoots of the plants rise from the soil that they knew would prove poisonous? Were they wrong to see with cultured foresight that those shoots would grow to devastate all that had allowed what they held dear? Were they wrong to build a bonfire in their garden to burn those shoots before they could spread their noxious seed? What is the force that rightly argues that all books are equal, that none may harm, that all should be allowed? None. All allow what does not threaten that which they are invested in saving. The path of art reflects the path of man, and there the rejection could be seen. An organism in an evolving environment, man responded to industry. And the ties that bound him through his history began to unravel the more. But in the anemic life that would grow, in its breadth of consumption, to wipe the world clean of living blood, through service of the basest of man's compulsions, the idea was set that to limit man's expression was the worst form of evil. And so the growth was accelerated, and thereby the notion that man should betray his judgment was secured. The notion that all should be accepted was secured, and generations were bred on that assumption. Man should do as he liked, provided whatever it was could be weaned of its profits, and provided it would not upset the distribution that was so desired by the dragon, provided the vampire could continue to feed. This time the vampire would not be banished. This time the vampires would put their teeth to the world, and then to the mind of man, and then all would be extracted and turned to gold, and then would be heaven on earth. The dragon is thus to the vampire what the moth is to the caterpillar. And for the dragon, heaven on earth is the holding of gold in a cave, the reward for the sucking dry of all that might otherwise have lived. Only the gold has value, and because they are the chosen, it is their right. Their God told them so.